The blizzard descended upon the Arizona mountains without mercy, transforming the rugged terrain into a blindfolded maze of white fury. The year was 1885, and Thomas Iron Walsh stood his ground in the swirling chaos, his Colt revolver steady despite the biting cold that threatened to steal feeling from his trigger finger. At 45, the former Union scout's weathered face told stories of battlefields survived and wilderness conquered. Yet nothing had prepared him for what this day would bring. The two cattle rustlers facing him through the curtain of snow hadn't expected resistance in this weather. They'd assumed the storm would cover their tracks as they drove off a dozen of Walsh's prime steers. They'd calculated wrong. "Last chance," Thomas shouted over the howling wind, voice carrying authority earned across 20 years of frontier life. "Walk away from my cattle and live to see tomorrow." The taller rustler, face scarred from forehead to jaw, eyes cold as the surrounding peaks, sneered and reached for his pistol instead. The gunshots cracked through the storm like splitting ice. Thomas fired first, his aim true despite the swirling snow. The tall rustler dropped, crimson blooming across white powder like spilled wine. His partner returned fire wildly before disappearing into the blinding whiteness. One bullet found flesh. Thomas felt the hot punch of lead in his shoulder, warmth spreading beneath his heavy coat in stark contrast to the freezing air. His horse, spooked by gunfire and storm alike, reared suddenly and bolted, disappearing into the white void with his supplies still secured to the saddle. Thomas stood alone, blood seeping between gloved fingers pressed to his wounded shoulder. 20 years of frontier survival had taught him the grim mathematics of his situation. Wounded, horseless, in a worsening blizzard, miles from his ranch. Death was calculating its approach with every passing minute. He trudged through knee-deep snow, each step more labored than the last. The former scout had survived Shiloh and Gettysburg, had infiltrated Confederate lines alone, had built a thriving ranch from nothing in this unforgiving territory. The thought of dying in an anonymous snowdrift seemed an insult to everything he'd overcome. Yet nature recognized neither pride nor past accomplishments. The wound sapped his strength with relentless efficiency. The cold invaded his bones, transforming his limbs to lead. When he stumbled over a hidden embankment and crashed down hard, his body simply refused to rise again. No amount of will could override the physical reality of his failing flesh. Thomas's vision narrowed to a tunnel of white, darkness creeping at the edges. Through this fading portal, impossibly, a figure approached. Not the fleeing rustler returned to finish him. Someone else, smaller, moving through the blizzard as if merely walking through a light spring shower. He blinked away ice crystals from his lashes. The figure resolved into a young woman dressed in fringed buckskins, a single dark braid whipping in the wind behind her. She wore no heavy coat, no proper winter gear, just traditional Apache clothing, entirely inadequate for the killing cold that was claiming him, despite his layers of wool and leather. Yet she moved without hurry, without struggle, utterly unaffected by conditions that were rapidly ending his life. Their eyes met across the blinding whiteness. Hers were dark, assessing, holding ancient knowledge that made him feel suddenly like a trespasser in this wilderness he'd claimed to master. She crouched beside him, studied his wound with clinical detachment. "I know who you are, Thomas Walsh," she said, her English perfect but accented. "You killed many of my people at Blue Canyon." Thomas tried to speak, but his jaw had stiffened with cold. Her words landed like fresh bullets. Blue Canyon, 8 years ago, a skirmish with Apache raiders. He'd been leading a cavalry patrol. The memories he'd buried resurfaced like corpses in spring thaw. "The bullet is still inside you," she continued, unmoved by his shock. "Without removing it, infection will kill you before dawn." Thomas finally found his voice cracked and weak. "Why, help me? I didn't say I would help you." Her eyes revealed nothing. "But I can. The choice is yours. Trust someone you once called enemy or die here in the snow. She stood waiting for his decision, seemingly indifferent to the outcome. The wind howled around them, the temperature plummeting as daylight faded. "Who are you?" Thomas managed. "Elena." Just the one name, offered reluctantly. "The whites in the valley call me the ghost woman of the mountain. My own people won't speak my name at all." She extended her hand, a gesture that demanded more courage from Thomas than any battlefield he had survived. "If you want to live, you must forget everything you think you know," she said. "Follow my rules, my ways, not yours." He grasped her hand. Elena's shelter was unlike anything Thomas had seen in his decades on the frontier. Built into a natural rock formation, part cave, part carefully constructed hideaway with framework of bent wood covered in hides. The entrance was nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, protected from wind on three sides by sheer rock faces. Inside, the wind's howl diminished to a distant moan. The temperature was not warm, but the brutal edge of the cold had dulled. Thomas collapsed onto furs laid across the ground, consciousness flickering as Elena examined his wound more thoroughly. "You're lucky," she said, producing a knife that gleamed in the dim light. "The bullet missed your lung by a finger's width." Thomas tensed, hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Elena merely raised an eyebrow. "You can shoot me, or I can save your life, not both." When she saw his hand relax, she nodded once and continued. "I learned medicine from two worlds, from my grandmother and from a white army doctor." "Army doctor?" Thomas managed through gritted teeth as she cut away his bloodied shirt. "Captain James Miller. He became lost in Apache territory during the winter of '79. My scouts found him half frozen, much like I found you." She worked as she spoke, preparing herbs and tools with practiced efficiency. "I helped him survive. In exchange, he taught me about bullet wounds infection, proper suturing, knowledge for survival. That was our bargain." Elena worked methodically, crushing herbs Thomas didn't recognize, mixing them with his own whiskey from his canteen. The pungent aroma filled the small space, earthy, medicinal, ancient. "This will hurt," she said simply. "Try not to scream. Sound carries in these mountains and Blackwood's men are still searching." "Blackwood?" Thomas's attention sharpened despite the pain. "What does landgrabber Randall Blackwood have to do with cattle rustlers?" Elena's hands paused briefly. "Those weren't just any rustlers. They work for Blackwood. I've watched his operation from these mountains for years. He's been systematically driving smaller ranchers out, buying their land for pennies. Your spread is one of the last obstacles to his complete control of the valley." As the knife probed for the bullet, Thomas bit down on a leather strap, memories of field hospitals during the war flooding back. The screams, the saws, the piles of amputated limbs. By comparison, Elena's methods were almost merciful. The bullet came out. The wound was cleaned, packed with herbs, and bound. Throughout it all, Thomas noticed something profoundly strange. She hadn't lit a fire. Despite materials for one stacked neatly against the wall, the shelter remained cold. "Why no fire?" he asked, voice hoarse from pain. Elena's expression changed slightly, the first hint of emotion she'd shown. "Because fire is what kills men like you in cold like this," she replied. "Your body is shutting down to preserve your core. If I warm you too quickly with external heat, your heart will stop trying to fight. Blood will rush to your frozen limbs. You will die feeling comfortable." She placed her hand directly over his heart, counting its beats. "Heat must come from within," she continued, "not without. That is the first lesson of survival your people never learned." Thomas woke to the sensation of fingers pressing against specific points on his wrist. Elena sat beside him, working methodically, her touch firm but precise. Morning light filtered through the hide walls, casting the interior in a soft amber glow. "What are you doing?" he asked, surprised to find his voice stronger. Keeping your blood moving, she replied without looking up. Your body wants to pull all warmth to your core. I'm forcing it to remember your extremities exist. Thomas studied her in the improved light. Young, mid-20s perhaps, but with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. The fringed buckskin dress she wore seemed impossibly inadequate against the cold, yet she showed no signs of discomfort. How long was I unconscious? Through the night, most of the morning. She released his wrist and moved to check his bandaged shoulder. The wound is clean. No fever yet. You said you know who I am, Thomas said carefully. Blue Canyon. Elena's hands paused momentarily before continuing their work. I was there, hidden in the rocks. I watched your soldiers kill my cousins. Thomas felt the weight of her words. It was war. It's always war with your people. No anger in her voice, just tired certainty. Even when there's peace on paper, there's war in the valleys. She finished examining his wound and sat back. You need to eat. Then I will teach you how to breathe. Breathe? I've been doing that just fine for 45 years. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Have you? Then why were you dying in the snow when I found you? The meal was simple. Strips of dried venison and a bitter tea made from bark she kept in pouches along the wall. It tasted like liquid fire going down, but warmth spread through Thomas's core afterward, more substantial than any coffee or whiskey he'd known. Now, Elena said, positioning herself in front of him, place your hand here. She guided his palm to her ribs, just below her chest. Thomas hesitated, the proximity unexpected. This isn't courtship, Thomas Walsh, she said dryly. This is survival. Feel the rhythm. Count it. Her breathing was controlled. 4 counts in, hold for 4. 4 counts out, hold for 4. Deep and deliberate, utterly different from normal respiration. Now match me. Thomas attempted to follow her pattern, finding his own breathing shallow and rapid by comparison. Slower, she instructed, deeper from the diaphragm. Your body doesn't need that much oxygen. You're creating heat with every breath, but only if you control it properly. They practiced this technique for what felt like hours. Gradually, impossibly, warmth began building in Thomas's chest, radiating outward through his limbs. Your people build big fires and sit beside them, Elena explained, letting your bodies grow lazy. When the fire dies, you're helpless. Apache learned to make fire inside, through controlled breath, through movement of blood, through will. As they practiced, Elena shared her story in measured sentences. Her father had been a cavalry officer who fell in love with an Apache woman during a brief peace. Their union created Elena, too white for the Apache, too Indian for the whites. When the peace ended, my father tried to protect a group of Apache families from a militia raid. Randall Blackwood shot him in the back for his trouble. Thomas stiffened. The same Blackwood who's been buying up the valley? The cattle baron? Elena nodded. The same. He was just a hired gun then. Now he wears fine suits and owns half the territory, but his methods haven't changed. She paused, eyes distant with memory. After my father died, my mother took me back to her people, but I was never truly accepted. When she died 5 winters ago, I came to these mountains alone. And you've survived here since then? Without contact with either world? Not entirely alone, Elena corrected. I watch both worlds from a distance. I trade with certain Apache families who don't mind my mixed blood. I observe the valley settlements through my father's field glasses. Knowledge is survival, Thomas Walsh. I know more about what happens in this territory than most who live in it. The storm's howl diminished briefly. Elena moved to the entrance, pushed aside the hide covering, and peered out. Her body language changed instantly, tensing like a predator sensing danger. What is it? Thomas asked. Tracks in the new snow, she said quietly. Your rustler friend has returned, with company. Thomas attempted to stand, faltered. How many? 4 men, armed. They're searching the area where I found you. Thomas checked his revolver. 3 bullets remained. Not enough. I recognize one of them, Elena continued, letting the hide fall back across the entrance. Jack Harrow, Blackwood's enforcer, the man who executed the Apache family I mentioned, a father and 2 young sons, called it clearing hostiles afterward. Thomas understood now. They had a common enemy. Blackwood had been terrorizing the region for years, driving smaller ranchers out, buying their land for pennies. Thomas's larger spread was likely next on his list. Those men outside, they're not just after you because of the rustling, Elena continued. Blackwood wants your land. The rustling was meant to weaken you, drain your resources. The storm intensified again, buying them time. As darkness fell, Elena taught Thomas more techniques. Pressure points to improve circulation, herbs that increase blood flow, rhythmic movements that generated internal heat. Tonight will be the true test, she said as the wind outside rose to a screaming pitch. The storm has reached its peak. We will practice what I've taught you. If you survive until morning, you might actually be worth saving. The night deepened. Wind shrieked against the shelter. Temperature plummeted beyond anything Thomas had experienced. Inside their sanctuary, Elena positioned herself beside him. Your wound limits what positions we can use, she said matter-of-factly. We'll adapt. She settled against his uninjured side, aligning her body with his, creating maximum contact for heat transfer. Synchronize your breathing with mine, she instructed. Allow your heartbeat to slow, matching mine. Trust your body knows how to survive if you guide it properly. As they breathed in unison, Thomas felt warmth building between them, not from fire, not from external source, but from within, just as she'd promised. Their shared rhythm created something greater than either could produce alone. The second great lesson, Elena whispered, survival is rarely achieved alone. Even wolves huddle together in killing cold. In the intimacy of shared breath and synchronized heartbeats, Thomas found himself revealing things he'd told no one. Nightmares from the war, the loneliness of his years building the ranch, the emptiness of success without family to share it. Elena listened silently. Then unexpectedly, she shared her own isolation. The pain of belonging nowhere, being claimed by no one, building a life in the margins between 2 worlds. My grandmother taught me these survival methods, Elena said softly. She was the tribe's medicine woman. 3 winters ago, she gave her life to save a young Apache boy caught in a storm like this. She transferred her warmth to him through these same techniques, knowing she wouldn't have enough left for herself. She sacrificed herself, Thomas said, understanding. Elena nodded. The final lesson she taught me, sometimes survival is about choosing when not to survive, about recognizing something more important than your own life. Outside, a branch snapped under the weight of snow. Both tensed, listening. Nothing followed but the howl of wind. Dawn is still hours away, Elena said. Rest. I'll keep watch. I thought shared warmth was essential for survival. She almost smiled. You've earned enough of my knowledge to survive one night alone, Thomas Walsh. Don't get greedy. Thomas woke to silence. The storm's fury had passed, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. Sunlight filtered through the hide walls, painting the interior with amber light. Elena was already up, checking his wound. The bleeding has stopped. Infection hasn't set in. You heal quickly for an old soldier. Not so old, he protested, testing his shoulder. Pain flared, but it was manageable. Just experienced. Experienced enough to know Blackwood's men will return now that the storm has passed? Thomas nodded grimly. They'll be looking to finish what they started. Elena moved to the entrance and peered out. The snow is deep, hard to move quietly. We'll hear them coming. Thomas joined her, surprised at his own steadiness after nearly dying twice, first from the bullet, then from the cold. The landscape had transformed. Pristine white stretched in all directions, punctuated by skeletal trees and rock formations bent under the weight of snow. Beautiful and deadly. We have 3 bullets, 1 good shoulder, and nowhere to run, Thomas assessed. Not ideal odds. You're thinking like a white man again, Elena replied. Always direct confrontation. Always force against force. She turned to him. What did I teach you about cold? Don't fight it. Work with it. Exactly. We won't fight Blackwood's men. We'll let nature fight for us. Their plan formed quickly. Using Elena's knowledge of the terrain and Thomas's military tactics, they prepared a series of traps around the shelter. Not to kill, they lacked resources for that, but to separate, disorient, and expose. Cold doesn't kill you immediately, Elena explained as they worked. It seduces you first, makes you tired, makes you make mistakes. We'll help that process along. By midday, they heard voices approaching, men struggling through deep snow, cursing the cold. Thomas positioned himself behind a rock formation. Elena disappeared into the whiteness like the ghost the valley folks named her. 4 men appeared, led by a tall figure with a distinctive red scarf, Jack Harrow, Blackwood's notorious enforcer. Known for his cruelty, his skill with a knife, his enjoyment of others' suffering. Walsh, Harrow called out. We know you're here somewhere. Blackwood sends his regards. Says that bullet was just a down payment. Thomas remained silent. Elena had taught him patience, another survival skill he'd neglected for too long. The men spread out, searching. One approached the hidden entrance to the shelter. Thomas tensed, finger on his revolver's trigger. 3 bullets, 4 men, bad mathematics. A soft whistle, barely audible, came from somewhere to his left. One of Harrow's men turned toward the sound, separated from the group. He disappeared around a rock formation. Minutes passed. The man didn't return. McCready, Harrow called. Report in. When no answer came, Harrow signaled another man to investigate. Check it out. Quietly. Thomas seized the moment of confusion. He fired once, not at the men, but at the snow buildup on the rock ledge above them. The bullet struck true, dislodging a small avalanche that crashed down, burying 1 man completely, partially covering another. 2 bullets left. 3 men, 1 missing, 1 buried, 1 struggling, Harrow untouched. Harrow fired wildly toward Thomas's position, forcing him back into cover. The half-buried man extracted himself, panicked. It's a trap, he shouted. There's someone else out here. Shut up and find Walsh, Harrow snarled. The panicked man stumbled away from Harrow, directly toward another of their prepared positions. Thomas heard a sudden crack. The man had fallen through a thin ice patch they disguised with snow, plunging into freezing water beneath. His screams echoed briefly through the mountains. Now it was one-on-one. Harrow versus Thomas. The enforcer was good, better than good. He moved from cover to cover, working his way closer to Thomas's position with professional efficiency. I know you're wounded, Walsh, Harrow called. Tracked your blood trail before the storm covered it. You can't win this. Thomas remained silent, controlling his breathing as Elena had taught him. Inhale slowly, hold. Exhale slowly, hold. His heart rate slowed. His hands steadied. A shadow moved behind Harrow, Elena materializing like an apparition. She held a knife. Thomas stood suddenly, drawing Harrow's attention and fire. The bullet grazed his already wounded shoulder. Thomas didn't flinch, didn't cry out. The cold had become his ally, numbing the fresh pain. He fired his second-to-last bullet, deliberately missing, keeping Harrow's focus. Elena struck, her knife finding the gap between Harrow's coat and collar. Not a killing blow, but enough to wound, enough to shock. The enforcer whirled, firing wildly. Elena was already gone, vanished into the white landscape. Thomas emerged from cover, revolver aimed squarely at Harrow's chest. "Drop it!" Blood stained the snow around Harrow's feet, spreading from the neck wound. "Blackwood will send more," he gasped. "Then I'll deal with them too." Thomas's voice was calm, certain. And eventually with Blackwood himself. Harrow's gun wavered, then lowered. "You've changed, Walsh. Something's different about you." "I've learned a few things about survival." Elena reappeared, retrieving weapons from the enforcer. "McCready won't be joining us," she reported. "He'll sleep beneath the snow until spring thaw." Harrow stared at her with a mixture of fear and hatred. The ghost woman, the half-breed witch, should have known. Elena's expression remained impassive. "Sit down before you fall down. You're bleeding out." They bound Harrow's wound, enough to keep him alive, nothing more. Elena worked efficiently, applying pressure, using snow to slow the bleeding. "Why not let me die?" Harrow asked through gritted teeth. "Because I want you to deliver a message," Thomas replied. "Tell Blackwood his days of terrorizing this valley are over. Tell him Thomas Walsh is coming for him." "You against Blackwood's whole operation?" Harrow laughed weakly. "You're a dead man." "Not alone," Elena said quietly. "He won't be alone." They gave Harrow the bare minimum to survive the journey back. Water, one blanket, directions to the nearest trail. They watched him stagger away, a beaten man carrying the seed of fear back to his employer. As the enforcer disappeared from view, Thomas turned to Elena. "You don't have to come with me. This isn't your fight. When you lay dying in the snow, I could have walked away. But I chose to help you." Her dark eyes met his. "This is my choice, too." Blackwood is dangerous. He practically owns the territory, the sheriff, the judge, most of the businesses. Then he needs to be stopped. Elena gathered her possessions, herbs, weapons, the knowledge of generations packed into pouches and bags. "My father died trying to protect innocent people from men like him. I won't dishonor his memory by hiding in these mountains forever." Thomas watched her prepare, realizing how much had changed in these few days. He'd come to the mountain a dying man with old knowledge that had failed him. He would leave it transformed. "I'll need to stop at my ranch first," he said. "Gather supplies, check on my hands. And I need to speak to certain Apache families in the foothills," Elena replied. "People who have suffered under Blackwood's expansion. People who might join our cause." "You think they'll fight alongside a white man?" "They'll fight alongside me," Elena said simply, "and I'll vouch for you. Actions matter more than blood to those who've lost everything." Before leaving, Elena knelt beside her grandmother's grave, a small stone cairn near the shelter, decorated with feathers and beads. She spoke softly in Apache, a prayer or farewell. "She would have liked you," Elena said softly as she rose. "My grandmother. She said the best students are those who face their own mortality." Thomas took her hand. "Then let's make sure her teachings didn't die with her." They started down the mountain together, footprints side by side in fresh snow. Behind them the shelter stood, not abandoned, just waiting. Ahead the valley opened up, Thomas's ranch barely visible in the distance. Between those 2 points lay uncertainty, danger, and the promise of justice. Blackwood built his empire on fear, Thomas said as they descended. Fear of cold, fear of hunger, fear of being alone. "You've taught me not to fear those things anymore." Elena nodded. "And you've reminded me there are things worth leaving the mountain for." "We'll need more than just the 2 of us," Thomas said, thinking aloud. "Even with your Apache allies." "We'll have more," Elena replied with quiet certainty. "There are others in the valley who've lost land, lost family to Blackwood's ambitions. They just need someone to stand with them, to show them it's possible." As they reached the tree line, Thomas paused, looking back at the mountains that had nearly claimed his life. What you said about your grandmother, about choosing when not to survive, I understand it now. Some things matter more than living. Yes, Elena agreed. But first we live. We survive. We fight. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Thomas saw fire in those dark depths. Blackwood doesn't know what's coming for him. A rancher who won't be broken and an Apache who can't be seen. Thomas nodded, feeling something he hadn't experienced since the war. Purpose, clarity, righteous anger channeled toward a worthy cause. The storm that nearly killed me was just the beginning, he said. The real storm is about to hit the valley. They continued their descent, two souls forged in isolation, now united in common purpose, carrying ancient wisdom and modern determination. The sun glinted off the snow, turning the world into a sea of diamonds, beautiful and treacherous, much like the path ahead. Behind them, their footprints began filling with fresh powder, nature erasing evidence of their passage. But the knowledge they carried, of survival, of cooperation, of finding strength in the most desperate circumstances, that would endure. Blackwood and his men would soon discover that the most dangerous enemies aren't always the ones you can see coming. Sometimes they're the ones who have learned to become one with the storm itself.